You might think that the conflict between Israel and Palestine has been going on since ancient times, and that it is centered around hatred towards another religion. In fact, the conflict is mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land. It started 100 years ago when Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917. Here, the British government announced support for a national home for the Jewish people.
So the Balfour Declaration was a statement, an official statement made by the Foreign Secretary of Britain in 1917. And basically what he said was, in 67 very famous words, he said the government of the United Kingdom is sympathetic with the Zionist movement and wants to create a national home for Jews in Palestine. Now, keep in mind, at this time, the population of Palestine is over 90% non-Jewish, and Palestine is still ruled by the Ottoman Empire. The British did not control Palestine, nor were the people living in Palestine British. And yet the British decided that they could offer Palestine to a different group of people.
This was done by creating borders and dividing land in the Middle East with the French when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, leading the British to control a region it called the British Mandate of Palestine. Growing sectarian violence in the land convinced the United Nations to approve a plan where British Palestine was divided into two separate states.
What they attempted to do is really divide the land in a way that lined up with the populations. But what that meant was, for the native Palestinians, that the land that they were living in, 55% of it would become a Jewish state. And so by March of 1948, what you began to see on the ground was a number of conquest operations on the part of the Zionist militias that resulted in the depopulation and destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages. And in fact, before May 15th, 1948, which is the date on which the Israeli state was proclaimed, already half the total number of refugees that were created during that period had been forced to flee, over 400,000. And so this process continued throughout the war, and ultimately somewhere between 750 and 800,000 Palestinians were forced into refugee life and were denied the right to return to their homes and villages by the newly created State of Israel, which really is the very foundation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as we know it today. By the spring of 1948, the United States withdrew its support for the plan. And what happened in the aftermath of that, when the Zionists on the ground in Palestine began to see that the preeminent power in the world was no longer backing this partition plan, which would create a Jewish state that they had wanted, they realized that at that point they had to create a state by force.
It has been 70 years since the plan was adopted on November 29, 1947. Since then, the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians is one marked by violence.
In that territory, about half of the people living there are Israeli Jews, and about half of the people living there are Palestinian Arabs and are not Jewish. And nonetheless, they live under the control of a state which defines itself as Jewish and denies to the people living under occupation a right to vote, and treats those Palestinians living in Israel as second-class citizens. So what you have since 1967 is essentially a one-state reality, where there is something of an apartheid system, where one group is privileged over another whose rights are denied.